David Brinkley. Now, from our Washington headquarters, here's David Brinkley.
It was the first terrible disaster ever to happen on live television, in full view of all of us, in full view of the entire world. And it took the lives of 7 people we all admired for their skill and courage, and one in particular, a high school teacher representing another group we all admire, our teachers, past and present. It saddened the entire nation. What does it mean? What happened? What are we to think about the space program in the future? We'll ask today's guests. Dr. William Graham, acting administrator of NASA. Senator John Glenn of Ohio, a former astronaut. Thomas Gold, professor of astronomy at Cornell University. Tom Wolfe, author of the much-admired book on space and the people who go out into it, The Right Stuff. Isaac Asimov, who writes on science and science fiction, over 300 books at last count. Some background on a shattering experience we all shared from our man Jack Smith. And our discussion here with George Will, Sam Donaldson, and Morton Kondracki, all here on our Sunday program. First, a little news. Last night, NASA put out some new pictures. They seem to show that on one of the 2 solid fuel boosters, there was a leak at a seam, and it shot out a plume of fire. NASA will draw no conclusions, but it is possible the flame burned through the skin of the huge tank of oxygen and hydrogen, set off a monumental explosion, and destroyed the shuttle. We'll see the pictures again shortly, and we'll ask the acting director of NASA to discuss them. Some other news from Cape Canaveral. A Marine helicopter lifted out of the sea and brought to shore a 10,000-pound orange cone. It was lifted out of the sea somewhere near Savannah, Georgia, to the north of the launch site. It was thought at first it was a part of the shuttle, but it may not be. NASA has said it has looked at it, or has had a description of it, and said, we don't even think it's a part of the fuel tank, and it may not even be a part of the shuttle. There's all kinds of stuff on the bottom of the sea in that area. One of the NASA people said when something was sighted, he said it could even be a Spanish galleon. Other news, Pope John Paul II is in India, asking for religious harmony in a country that has very little of it. And the Pope met the leader of another religious community, the Dalai Lama, in exile from Tibet. Haiti, more or less quiet this morning after the revolt against President Duvalier seems to have failed. In the Philippines election, President Marcos says his political enemies are out to kill him. While in Costa Rica today, they're electing a new president peacefully and quietly. We'll be back with all the rest of today's program in a moment.
This Week with David Brinkley, brought to you by General Electric. At GE, we bring good things to life.
None of us will ever forget the vivid sights of this past week. The pictures will be in our children's history textbooks. Before we ask our guests for their thoughts, and before it all slips into the mists of history, here's Jack Smith with a brief look at an event that affected us all. Jack?
David, the president himself Friday led the nation in mourning.
Across America, we are reaching out, holding hands, and finding comfort in one another.
The inclusion of an ordinary American, a school teacher in the doomed shuttle, enlarged the tragedy.
Engine throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
The whole nation watched this week as its sons and daughters, its best hopes and dreams, were blown up 10 miles in the sky from Launch Pad 39B. The shock was greater for the millions of school children who watched. They'd come to identify closely with Christa McAuliffe, the first teacher in space.
You were our brightest star, Christa. Your life was shortened, but your light was oh so brilliant.
McAuliffe's parents listened broken-hearted to her eulogy in New England. Adults everywhere worried about the after-effects on impressionable children, and the entire country mourned not only McAuliffe, but also Jarvis, McNair, Onizuka, Resnik, Scobee, and Smith.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends.
Sometimes when we reach for the stars, we fall short. But we must pick ourselves up again and press on, despite the pain.
In spite of the president's exhortation, until the cause of this week's tragedy here at Cape Canaveral is confirmed and fixed, the U.S. space program is on hold. The Tuesday launch was shown by NASA from only one perspective. This hotspot led to speculation this week that a rip in the skin of one of the solid fuel boosters sent a blowtorch of flame into the side of the external fuel tank, which later exploded. Last night, NASA released these new pictures taken from another angle, which seemed to bear out that theory. NASA investigators told ABC News the new videotape is convincing, but publicly, NASA was more cautious.
You should not draw a conclusion either from the fact it was released and certainly not as to either cause or effect of that.
Searchers, meanwhile, have been pulling pieces of the ill-fated shuttle from the ocean, but the now suspect boosters won't be found intact. They were destroyed from the ground after the explosion when they became a safety hazard. Investigators have also begun seeking evidence in the piles of printouts from the shuttle's onboard computers, and congressmen are already asking questions.
I think we're going to have to take an even harder look than the budget would have forced on us in any event this spring as to just what our priorities are for the next decade.
The disaster has cast a pall not only over the shuttle program and its policy of sending civilians into space, but also on the U.S.'s plans for a manned space station in the coming decade and NASA's whole approach to space.
The first flight totally dedicated to Department of Defense mission.
The shuttle was designed to haul military and civilian payloads into space cheaply and frequently. It has failed to do so. And with one of its 4 shuttles now gone, NASA will have trouble meeting its launch schedules. All of this raised questions this week whether NASA's total investment in manned flight is wise when expendable rockets and unmanned flights can do the job as well.
This could result in a greater emphasis within NASA on the unmanned programs rather than the manned programs.
The overwhelming bulk of the scientific work in space can be done without human beings in space, and it can be done much cheaper generally.
The extraordinary success last month of the unmanned probe Voyager 2 in sending back data on the planet Uranus demonstrated that. But there's more than just dollars and cents involved in sending men and women into space.
There is a binding feeling that comes from people in space who have flown and had that viewpoint and that perspective of our Earth that no machine is going to bring back that emotion.
This is Freedom 7. The fuel is go.
There's a spiritual utility for those of us here on Earth in seeing our own kind and not just machines on the cutting edge of space exploration. It satisfies our deepest yearnings. It's why we've always been fascinated by space, even when it was others who went there. And we've invested a piece of ourselves in those who go. And that's why this week's tragedy was such a shock to the whole nation, for it touched all Americans personally. Christa McAuliffe's parents, bewildered and uncomprehending after the shuttle exploded. The reaction of their daughter's school pupils.
The vehicle apparently exploded.
The somber, reassuring words of the president.
The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
The unconsolable grief of the families. Like other national disasters, like the assassination of a president, this week's images of tragedy and grief will be etched in most of our minds forever. This week will be frozen in time. The nation stunned, shocked. David?
Jack, thank you. Coming next, Dr. William Graham, the acting administrator of NASA, and shortly, Senator John Glenn, one of the early astronauts, and Thomas Gold, professor of astronomy at Cornell University and a specialist in space exploration. Tom Wolfe and Isaac Asimov, 2 writers who have explored this subject, in a moment. Dr. Graham, thanks very much for coming in to be with us today. Happy to have you. We know you've been having a hard time.
Thank you, David.
Here with us are George Will of ABC News and Sam Donaldson, ABC News White House correspondent. Now, Dr. Graham, this morning your agency, NASA, put out some new, not tape, but film, made from a different angle from that we have been seeing during the week. If you're agreeable, we would like to show it now, and I'll ask you to describe it and tell us whatever you can about it while it's running.
Certainly, David.
So if you would, here we go now.
Yes. What you see is a plume, a second plume showing up above the normal plume at the exit cone of the solid rocket booster, which is strapped to the side of the expendable tank on the shuttle stack. The second plume is an anomalous situation which we have never seen on a launch of the shuttle before. And you can see that second plume appears to grow and grow. That's the area where it's occurring until finally it goes to the explosion point. We don't know at this point what all the data indicates concerning that.
Now, here's a model of the shuttle launch construction. Where is this plume that we were just seeing?
All right, David, let me show you. It's on the, if you orient yourself on the stack, here's the shuttle, the expendable tank, and the two solid rocket boosters, which burn for the first 2 minutes of the flight to give us our initial ascent propulsion. Right. The plume appeared right in this area, just above the point where the solid rocket attaches to the expendable tank. And the plume came out on this side, the side away from the shuttle itself.
Now, I'm not asking you to offer any final opinion, but as a preliminary judgment, that plume could easily have burned through the big tank?
David, I'm more than willing to tell you anything I know as a fact, but I don't think it would be productive for me or for NASA to speculate. We're going to release the factual information as soon as we can, and when we've pulled it all together and cross-checked it, understand it, we'll tell you what we think happened.
When this craft goes up, there's an enormous, it's wired back to the Earth, and it's sending back a lot of telemetry data.
Yes.
Was there no indication at all, in spite of how thoroughly wired this is, that something was going wrong during that was what, at least 10 seconds?
Yes.
That this plume was visible.
Yes.
And for that 10 seconds, the telemetry did not pick up the fact that something was malfunctioning here?
Well, George, we telemeter back about 4,000 channels of data from the launch. We present only a selected subset of that to the crews on the ground, that data which we think they can usefully employ during the launch ascent itself. The rest we store for engineering data and use later. These solid rocket boosters are primary structure. They bear the same relation to the shuttle as the wing on a commercial transport bears to the fuselage.
But is it not,
it has to be there.
But is it not correct, Dr. Graham, that the telemetry showed that this right SRB dropped by about 4% as far as the power output is concerned in relation to the left SRB for those 10 seconds?
Sam, we're looking at that very carefully, as you might imagine. The process of understanding telemetry is a little more complex than just looking at a chart. It's got to be time-tied to the signals, it's got to be calibrated, and then the pressure in these SRBs is designed to vary as you go through the flight profile. So we've got to compare that with the nominal pressure variation. When all that's done, we'll make that available as soon as we think we've got a factual
Is it correct that you have, during these flights, an individual whose job it is to look at the telemetry, whatever it is that you have coming back, and compare the left and the right SRBs? And if there was such an individual, are you telling us that he saw no variation, or simply that the variations seemed either to be within normal tolerance or in some other way unexplained?
There's a normal range of variation in SRB performance because you can't make any two things completely identical. You've got to remember these are 150 feet long and weigh
was there
close
such
to
a
a
man?
million pounds. But we do have a man, in fact several people, who watched the performance of the SRBs, and they detected nothing anomalous from the telemetry they were actually receiving and was being given to them. But that's not the complete set of telemetry.
This is a tremendous payload you're throwing into space, and you've done it routinely and skillfully up until this point. But is it possible that in the whole program, in order to save weight, that the membranes of this equipment here has been kept perhaps beneath the margin of safety?
It certainly hasn't been kept beneath the margin of safety. It's designed to be a lightweight structure for the ascent, but we run engineering check after engineering check. We have engineering telemetry on it, and even more at the start of the program. And we think it's in fact stronger by a considerable margin than that ever required to take the loads it gets during ascent.
As you know, the shuttle was a problematic device from the start. It barely escaped the budget axe in the Nixon White House. It came within one mistakenly cast vote of being killed in the Congress one day. And it was supposed to produce commercial and industrial advantages on a payload and a pay scale that it hasn't fulfilled. Can you say with certainty that there hasn't been the cutting of corners and the rushing of things to try and get it to maximize its economic effectiveness, so that somewhere along the line something didn't get done that should have been done?
Well, I can say that there were certainly no corners cut, and the engineering tests were as complete as we could humanly make them. The budget situation was brought along, and we didn't get the shuttle built as fast as we wanted to because of funding issues, but we never compromised on safety, and we never compromised on reliability. That was the first rule and the first priority of NASA throughout the program. And the President has said there'll be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue.
I'd like to take you back to the solid rocket booster we were talking about. And I know that you have said that you're not going to speculate as to whether that plume was actually the cause of the mishap. But let's talk about the rocket burning. Am I correct in believing that when a rocket burns in an abnormal way, as this may have done, it's either that the fuel wasn't packed properly, or in some respect there is a hot spot that was allowed to develop because of an imperfect fuel, or that the skin somehow had a weakness which allowed at a certain point a burning through of the skin, or both? Have I correctly identified the possible problems here?
You've identified a few of the things that might possibly have gone wrong, but by no means the whole set, Sam. There's a very large structure of what we call fault trees, things that can affect other things and things that can go wrong. There are so many different possibilities that I doubt that you believe me.
But I'm talking about the burning of a fuel.
I am too. Just that. There are many issues that have to be taken into account, and we took them all into account, we thought, when we ran the many qualification tests and the qualification firings on these solid rocket boosters. And of course, we saw very, very predictable performance during the first 24 shuttle launches.
Now,
so we're
can I just ask one more question?
Surprised to have seen that extra plume.
Technical question.
Sure.
You didn't have sensors at this particular spot. We understand you can't have sensors on every square inch, I suppose, of every piece of skin of the shuttle. But would you think that in future flights, you might have more sensors in more places to try to bring back more instant telemetry?
I can't predict exactly what we'll do because that depends on what we find out. But I can assure you, whatever the problem proves to be, we're going to take every action possible to correct it before the shuttle goes up again. And
that adds weight, though, doesn't it? More sensors add weight.
They'll add somewhat more weight, but that's a penalty that has to be paid if you have to monitor more things. And we actually vary the number of sensors from time to time, depending on the mission and the things we're trying to accomplish. But we'll work this out, and we'll qualify the system again. And since it's shown its basic reliability in the first 24 flights, we don't think there's a major reconfiguration problem here. We think there's an engineering problem somewhere that has to be taken care of.
Dr. Graham, a slightly less technical question. We have been hearing for the last 24 hours, I guess, that some large fragment, presumably of this spacecraft, has been sighted on the ocean floor. It has not yet been recovered, has it? And do you have any idea what it might be? Could it conceivably be a part of the orbiter where the crew was?
David, there are a lot of objects on the ocean floor there that were there before the accident. There are no doubt more objects there now. The current is murky and swift in that area. It's hard to get a good visual image. We're going out systematically identifying each one of those objects, picking it up, bringing it back, and then turning it over to NASA and cataloging it with the staff there. After we've done that, we'll tell you what we found.
When you say there isn't...
I'm sorry, Sam, our time is up. Dr. Graham, thank you. Thanks very much for coming in today, and we wish you luck with finding out what happened, preventing its repetition.
Thank you.
Coming next, Senator John Glenn of Ohio, one of the earliest of our astronauts, and Thomas Gold, professor of astronomy at Cornell University, formerly a board member and advisor to NASA, and a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee. And shortly, two writers on space exploration, Tom Wolfe and Isaac Asimov. In a moment.
British Civic Society tomorrow at 5.
Senator Glenn, Professor Gold, thank you very much for coming in with us today. Happy to have you here. Now, you have just seen and heard the new film. I mention film because it is not tape. Tape you can see right away. Film, as we all know, has to be developed. So it wasn't available to NASA or to any of us until sometime after the launch. It was taken from the opposite side of the launch pad from the tapes we have been seeing all week, and it showed something we have not seen very clearly before. It showed what appeared to be a plume of fire coming out of the solid rocket booster going toward this huge tank. What would you make of that, Senator Glenn?
Well, I think it's a little early to speculate that that might have been the sole reason. I think, as Dr. Graham said, they're still putting this all together. That's some new film information. There may be other film. The plume looks like it could have caused a big problem, obviously. But they're very thorough and very painstaking in going through this type analysis. And there are, you know, the channels of telemetry and dual recordings, and you compare them, and you're working against millisecond time bases. And that looks, obviously, that was not right. But whether that was the final cause of the blow-up or not, I think has to remain to be seen.
Professor Gold, would you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I don't really want to add my wisdom to the speculation as to what caused it, but I would like to say something adjacent to this question. We shouldn't think that there is just one particular thing that can destroy such a vehicle. The shuttle has been an extraordinarily safe vehicle all along, by comparison with any other launch vehicles we've ever known, I think. It had one disaster now. It will be fixed, I'm sure, but we should not consider that the chance of 1 in 24 can be made very much, can be improved upon very much. I think we'll have to take that kind of a risk as a risk for a long time to come, whether it's this particular accident or any other.
There's a certain tension, is there not, in the space program now that's going to become severe as we try to fund, under current budgetary restraints, the manned space station. For commercial, industrial, and military purposes, you can make a strong argument for human beings in space, but pure science hardly needs men up there. It has these gadgets. What is the, given budgetary realities, are we on the right path? Are we allocating the right mixture to manned space and unmanned space? Senator Glenn?
Well, I think we are. And I know Professor Gold has had a long history behind him here of opposing much of the manned space program, and I appreciate his views on that. But I think the proper space sciences program, to me, is one that hits a balance. Wherever mankind travels in space, George, we're going to always precede. We're always going to have those unmanned vehicles out ahead. But it's like, I was talking to Annie about, it's like going to the beach. Now, Professor Gold could sit at home and he could turn on the electric fan to get the breeze, the light overhead, and put his feet in a bucket of water. But if he goes to, then he's got all the same elements that he might have sensed remotely. Now, if he goes to the beach, it's a glorious day. It's a human experience out there, and he can see the cliff over here where the shells are and all of the different things in the sand, and it may be different. There are fish jumping out here. He learns far, far more going into that laboratory of human experience on the beach than he ever would gain by remote control.
Yeah, but it cost him $10 to go to the beach, not $10 billion.
Well, George, I mean, Sam. All right, so we make a ridiculous point out of it, Sam.
I'm not making a ridiculous point, am I, Senator? The American taxpayers pay for this program.
Yes, certainly.
And it's wonderful to say we'd all like to go into space. I would. Yeah. You've been there.
That's right.
But at what cost? What are your views?
Well,
I know already, but state them, please.
Well, obviously, we're not in the business of funding each individual joyride as a joyride. The question is whether it is important to fly people in space, as we're doing at the present time, repetitively in a low Earth orbit, just skimming the Earth's atmosphere, not doing anything essentially new. Making observations which can certainly be done from unmanned craft and are being done from unmanned craft extremely well. You see, I'm not generally opposed to manned space flight. If we could really fly in the way in which the science fiction writers describe, you know, a joystick in hand and zoom around among the planets, that would be fascinating and important and scientifically important and as a human experience enormous. But we're nowhere near being able to do that. We're absolutely reduced, so long as we have chemical rockets as the only effective propulsion. We're not going to fly a manned expedition that can land on Mars and comes back, and we can fly 1,000 times in close Earth orbit around the Earth.
Are you saying there's no successor to the chemical rocket?
There's no what? Successor?
To the chemical rocket?
If you can invent one day, I have no doubt There will be some great new invention and some great new breakthrough. But when that comes, it will be many years between the great invention being made that is a total...
But isn't that how you get there? By
by going around repetitively around Earth orbit, you're not getting any closer to it.
Could I put this in proper perspective? If the professor's talking about my flight in the little Mercury capsule, 3,900 pounds, all up weight, ready to go, fine. We couldn't put a lot of experiments and research aboard there. We developed these things step by step. We went through Gemini, we went through the Apollo and onto the moon and back, and now we're into the space shuttle, which for the first time gives us a space and the people up there to do the basic fundamental research. That's what the program is all about. Now, we have the unmanned space program that goes out ahead of us and learns some of the things, and then we supplement that. And as we get to the permanently orbiting space station one of these days, then we'll be able at that point to then start using space as a permanent laboratory. We build this up step by step by step. And you can't just make the quantum leap from an interest in the space program to a giant space station zooming around the cosmos out here someplace. We build up to it, and that's what we're doing.
In space, Senator, what is our ultimate objective, or do we even know?
Basic fundamental research. If there's one thing this country has learned, it seems to me, Sam, it's that since our founding days, we put more into basic research, into study and inquiry of the unknown, and out of that has come our whole society that we know it here today. Out of that, our inquisitive, curious, questing nature. Professor, and we have triumph after triumph after triumph. Then occasionally we have a tragedy that pays the price, and that's where we are right now.
Professor Gold, you're an astronomer.
Yes.
It was planned this summer, August or September, I think, to put into space, by way of the shuttle, a huge telescope,
yes,
which, being free of the atmosphere and distractions and moisture and dirt and reflections and so on, would give you a clearer view,
yes,
than is possible on Earth.
An enormously important project.
Well, I can hardly wait to see it done. Would that not require manned flight to do that?
Unfortunately, we have linked the dispatch into space of unmanned vehicles like the Space Telescope to the manned program. I think it was a very unwise decision, because then it will make the launching of unmanned vehicles dependent on the manned program and on the possible interruptions, and as we now see. My feeling is that this project and the Galileo project to Jupiter, which is another very large unmanned vehicle fully built, are so important that since we are now constrained to launch them with the shuttle, we should go ahead and do that.
Professor Gold, Senator Glenn, thank you. Thanks very much for coming in. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Coming next, Isaac Asimov, a biochemist by training and a writer of science and science fiction, and the author of somewhere like 300 books, and Tom Wolfe, author of a book exploring in detail the space program and the men and women who work in it, entitled The Right Stuff. In a moment.
The Man of Steel, people like Alan Shepard and John Glenn, into an era in which space was going to be for the public, and that's what Christa McAuliffe represented. She was a woman who taught social studies in a high school in New Hampshire. She was, in effect, going to be the first space coach passenger, and the last thing in the world that NASA had in mind for this flight was anything to do with pioneering or anything to do with heroism. But this young woman found herself, whether she knew it or not, or wanted to be there or not, out on the edge of a still raw technology. And so this crossover that, which was in a way the purpose of the entire shuttle program, is now in great doubt.
Mr. Asimov?
Well, I think this is a test of the human spirit. In every piece of pioneering that humanity has ever performed, we have had casualties. The exploration of the United States and its settlement has left a trail of blood and death from the East Coast to the West Coast. And yet here the United States is. The Arctic and the Antarctic were similarly explored at the cost of the deaths of many brave people. It would be most unusual and unbelievable if space cost us nothing. Well, it is costing us something, and now the question is whether we can continue anyway, despite the cost.
Mr. Asimov, there's a question here raised by the previous guest, Professor Gold, as to how far we're going to go ever, given certain technological limitations. That is, Given the problem of lifting great weights with chemical rocketry, we are, and have been now for 10 years or so, stuck just skimming around the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. Is it realistic to expect that manned space travel has a future in the sense of going beyond this Earth and its moon?
Well, I'm not willing to bet on it, you understand, but certainly there's a reasonable chance. Back at the beginning of this century, an astronomer named Simon Newcomb proved very convincingly that an airplane could not fly, and it could not be made to hold the weight of a human being. And when the Wright brothers flew, he wrote another article saying, all right, one man, but not two. So that it is easy to find limits. And undoubtedly there are limits under the present technology, but we expect the technology to improve, and we may astonish ourselves just as a modern superjet would certainly astonish the Wright brothers.
Mr. Wolf, let me ask you about this crossover. It's one thing when people who are trained to be astronauts and part of the program pay a price for this exploration. We all grieve over that. But it's another when the crossover has occurred and someone who is not there as an astronaut, but as a civilian to represent us all and make the crossover, pays the penalty. Are you suggesting that that has set back the civilian in space program or the entire manned space program?
No, I think it has set back the civilian program, but you have to understand that that was the entire purpose of the shuttle. What had happened was that during the Apollo phase, when we were going to the moon, the Congress, the people of the United States were willing to pay any price. Down at NASA, they used to talk about budgetless financing. Whatever NASA wanted, it got from Congress, and the people and Congress were glad enough to pay it. Then a kind of hangover set in, and suddenly NASA found its budget cut very rapidly from 1969 into the 70s. They could barely keep the lights on down there in Houston, and so they really dusted off what had been the old X-20 program. They improved it with the technology they had now had in hand, and they unveiled the shuttle. And the idea was, if you want something that's practical and tangible, that'll bring results to the public, we'll give you that.
Are you saying, sir, that we put Christa McAuliffe in space in order to get more money for the space program?
The shuttle was in response, in no small part, I think, in response to the budget. And Christa McAuliffe certainly represented the culmination. There was nothing wrong with this idea. If the cosmic notions of going to Mars, for example, that was on the NASA had a voyage to Mars on the drawing boards, and it could have taken place as early as the late 1970s. The country didn't want that anymore, just as Ferdinand and Isabella didn't want Columbus to go to America a fifth time. So it was a combination of NASA saying we'll do what we can, and what they could do was is create a program in Earth orbit that would bring the public in the form of corporations and citizens like Christa McAuliffe into space.
Well, Mr. Wolf, perhaps we gave a hostage to fortune in that sense. That as we began to justify the space program in the most banal utilitarian ways, they said we ought to go into space because we got non-stick frying pans out of space technology. Maybe, do we need a new vocabulary to discuss space?
You put your finger right on it, George. NASA has never, the country, let's not put it on NASA's shoulders, the country has never had a philosophy of space exploration. It didn't need it at the beginning. All that was required was, and this seemed like a big all, was to catch up with the Soviets in space. It seemed a problem of absolutely crucial nature for this country. So you didn't need to have a reason to go into space. This idea of keeping up with the Soviets continued right through July of 1969 when we finally reached the moon. Once we had done that, we had won the space race, suddenly NASA found itself without a philosophy of space, and we still don't have that. The only philosopher that NASA ever had that I'm aware of was Wernher von Braun.
Mr. Asimov, what's your view?
What do I say about this? Well, first place, we have to remember that Christa McAuliffe was a volunteer. She was not conscripted. And the second thing is that it's always a belittling mistake to say that the space program has just brought us non-stick frying pans. It has brought us infinite knowledge of all kinds, saved uncounted number of lives, etc., just from the fact that we know where hurricanes are. And in the future, there are power stations in space, there are observatories and laboratories in space, there are people who are going to be living in space. I don't say that this will happen. I say it can happen. There's a glorious future ahead for us in space. if we're willing to reach for it, and if we're not going to fall back simply because occasionally it costs.
Mr. Asimov and Mr. Wolf, thank you. Thanks very much for being with us today. We've enjoyed hearing your views. Thanks for